Hello, I'm Lily Bentley, and today I'll be talking about bodily transformation and body horror in British and Irish traditional songs. Just a quick content notice before we begin. The nature of the talk means that we'll be exploring themes of death, murder, and the mutilation of human remains pretty much from the get-go. There will also be some discussion of seal hunting, and brief non-explicit references to sexual assault and suicide. I also want to manage expectations in the opposite direction. The source material we'll be examining today is more horrifying if you stop and think about it than explicitly gory, and there will be no graphic images on the slides. What there will be is a number of historic images that I'm using purely for decorative purposes, but are interesting in their own right, like this photograph of the dancer Loie Fuller, who was famous for choreography where she appeared to metamorphose into different creatures on stage. If you want to know more, there will be links in the show notes. And speaking of the show notes, for reasons of time and copyright, I won't be playing song clips during the talk, but you'll be able to find Spotify and YouTube playlists for all of the songs featured at the link shown on the screen. The two playlists are slightly different due to availability, but include at least two versions of each song. The show notes also include recommendations for books, articles, and online resources. This talk originated as a vague idea of exploring body horror in folk songs, which immediately brought to mind one song in particular. It is known as The Cruel Sister, The Twa Sisters, The Bonny Swans, Binnery, and many other names. I will be using The Cruel Sister to refer to the story versions as a group, but the words on the slide are from the end of Lorena McKennett's 1994 version titled The Bonny Swans. This modern version combines imagery from multiple earlier versions of the song, which makes it a helpful point of reference. The fundamentals of the story are that a young woman is drowned by her jealous sister, and her body is recovered further downstream. Her bones and hair are then used to build a harp, which then immediately begins to play itself. In some versions, it ends there. In this one, and in several others, the harp is taken to court and reveals the murderer in song when played in the presence of the guilty sister and her family. Paul G. Brewster's research suggests that the song likely has Scandinavian roots, which is not uncommon for British and especially Scottish songs due to historic trade routes. It appears in print in England from the mid-17th century, and many different variants have been collected in England, Scotland and America. Some omitting the supernatural elements entirely, others differing in more subtle ways, such as substituting the harp for a fiddle. So we're talking about a story that has a centuries-long history and a very large geographical reach. But it is also very, very weird. Not just in the sense that finding the corpse of a total stranger and thinking, "Fabulous, I needed some tuning pegs," is not the act of a normal, well-balanced travelling musician. But that the imagery of the instrument of bone and hair appears to be without equivalent in the popular folk canon. And it is nonetheless one of the most enduring traditional songs, capturing imaginations from the 17th century to the present day. With that in mind, it seems worth exploring this story in the wider context of the use of the body in traditional songs, and how the underlying themes of the song fit into that wider picture. For, as we will see, while this song is on the one hand highly unusual in its use of the body, it is also connected to broader ideas of death and transformation found in other traditional songs and stories. In the next slide, I will start laying out some context for this talk and the featured songs, before taking a very brief look at the history of the British and Irish song tradition, the ways in which these songs have been preserved and transformed, and what that means for interpretation. The main part of the talk will draw on a range of songs to explore two key themes: how the body has been described in the context of death and decay, and how bodily transformation forms part of stories about both supernatural and human subjects. We'll then bring this back to The Cruel Sister and see how we can situate this highly unusual song within the world of folk song storytelling. Just to give a very quick idea of who I am and where I'm coming from, My academic training is in early modern history. My recent research has been focused on interpersonal violence during the late 17th to mid-18th centuries, but I am more broadly interested in the lives and experiences of ordinary people from the 17th century onward. I am also an amateur folk singer, performing mainly English, Scottish and Irish unaccompanied traditional songs. And so these are the two perspectives that I'll be bringing to today's talk. I'd also like to say a few words about the song choices for today, which were selected based on three key criteria. Firstly, there are versions of each song found in England, Scotland and/or Ireland, and in some cases all three. As we've seen already, folk songs associated with Britain and Ireland can both originate from and spread to other parts of the world. And there are particularly strong connections with Scandinavia and America due to trade and immigration. But we'll be focusing primarily on the British and Irish context. Secondly, each song contains themes of transformation, destruction and/or reconstruction or reanimation of the human body, or bodies that closely resemble the human. And thirdly, all of the songs are still regularly performed in one or more forms today. In other words, they are part of a living folk tradition. For the purposes of the slides, I'll be displaying song lyrics that are not necessarily the oldest or most sung version of a song, but include the highest density of the ideas found across different variations that are relevant to the key themes. This is purely for ease of discussion. We'll therefore often be looking at songs and ideas that have roots in the 17th century or even earlier, but are not necessarily primary sources from that century in the form that we hear them today. And it's worth unpacking that a little further. Folk music is often thought of as primarily an oral tradition, with songs passed down from one singer to the next. But for centuries, the oral tradition has coexisted to a greater or lesser extent with other forms of dissemination. British and Irish ballads appeared in print from the 16th century, both in printed collections of songs and as individual broadside ballads. And these printed versions then fed back into the music shared between people in social spaces, giving the words a reach beyond the literate population. In the 19th century, a rising interest in folk music led to the collecting, indexing and preservation of British and Irish songs on both sides of the Atlantic, both by musicians and by people with varied academic interests. These collections incorporated both surviving print copies and versions collected directly from singers, initially in writing and then as sound recording developed in the early 20th century in actual field recordings that allowed for the preservation of performance styles as well as words and tunes. When we talk about the folk music canon then, we're talking about something where an ancient oral tradition has coexisted and cross-pollinated with print for hundreds of years and sound recording for over a century. That makes it an exceptionally rich playground, but also creates complexities around chronology, authorship and questions of authenticity. Collectors have been motivated by different literary, musicological, ethnographic and ideological interests, which shaped their approach to folk music. For example, one of the most famous names in the song collection is Francis Child, who was Professor of English at Harvard. Child was not particularly interested in music, but saw folk songs as expressions of an oral literature that might reflect the true voice of the people. But practices of discovering, recording and creating new performances of folk songs were and are often more transformative than the term collecting suggests. Tunes and words could be collected separately and later combined. Verses could be altered and whole new songs could be written on top of old tunes or the foundations of an old story. For example, the Irish song She Moved Through the Fair is a combination of a traditional tune, parts of a traditional song, and verses written by the poet Padraig Colum and published in 1909. Similarly, one of the songs we'll be exploring later, The Great Silkie of Sewell-Skerry, is a traditional song collected by Francis Child without the tune, and the tune it is now most often sung to was written by Jim Waters in 1954. The English folk musician Martin Carthy said in 2011 that traditional music is not an archive. If you see it as that, it becomes like a butterfly in a glass case. Folk music has to live and breathe, I'm not interested in heritage. This stuff is alive. We must claim it, use it. This is not a universally held view. There are collectors and musicians who are very concerned with the preservation of old songs in as original a form as possible. But Martin Carthy's words reflect a long tradition of creative engagement with traditional material that in turn must be engaged with when digging into the histories of folk songs. For the purposes of this talk, I will be largely approaching songs with multiple versions holistically, because today is more about exploring key themes and imagery and the historical ideas that underpin them. This will to a certain extent elide and simplify the regional variations and evolution of the songs, but will hopefully give us a foundation for meaningful discussion. And now let us move swiftly on to our first theme. In The Cruel Sister, the actual death of the drowned woman happens more or less between the lines. She is pushed in, and she washes up. But her mortal remains are central to the outcome of the story, both physically and through the supernatural agency that they possess. In this section, I want to explore contemporary ideas of the physical and metaphysical process of death, and the treatment of the dead, and the ongoing role of the dead in the lives of the living, to start building up a picture of the cultural mechanics behind the Cruel Sister story. John Blair wrote in his recent book, Killing the Dead, that the modern view of death as a singular moment of transition is not common across history. Before the modern era, it was normal to think of the physical death of the body as part of a process, and one that involved both the deceased and those close to them in rituals designed to allow the dead to rest in peace. It is, of course, from the possibility of these processes going wrong that we get the fear of vampires and other undead figures. But on a more commonplace level, historians working in the field of death studies have also shown that many of the rituals around death and dying can be understood as an important way for the bereaved to feel a sense of control, and that they are doing something to help, in an age where very little could be done medically for a person at the end of life. Similarly, the rules around mourning periods, which can often seem very prescriptive, can also be seen to provide an external framework for navigating the grieving process. And we can see this in the kinds of mourning rituals that make it into popular songs. Let's explore that further through two songs, The Unquiet Grave and The Wife of Usher's Well. The Unquiet Grave has been argued to date back as far as the 15th century, but the earliest written records are Victorian. It begins with a young woman mourning by the graveside of her lover, who has been dead for a year and a day. The deceased lover then appears to her and complains that her constant grieving is preventing him from resting in his grave. She begs him for one last kiss, but he refuses, because a kiss from the dead would endanger her life. He exhorts her to accept that he must be now left to decay, and she must continue to live until her own time comes. So here we can see the theme of death as a process, which takes place over a lengthy period of time and is actively experienced by the dead. And it is furthermore an experience that can be disturbed or disrupted by the actions of those still living. The song invokes a common folk belief that excessive tears run down into the grave, in this case wetting the winding sheet, and making for a soggy, miserable corpse. The bereaved lover's excessive mourning is an active problem for the dead, and the dead must rise to resolve the situation. These are ideas we'll return to, but before we do so, it's also worth exploring how this song describes death and the physical decay of the body. On the left of the slide, we have the relevant parts of The Unquiet Grave. The right is another song collected in the 19th century and translated from the Irish. The title translates as "I am stretched on your grave," and the song is inspired by a 17th century poem of the same name. There is another much better known song of that name that is a much simpler, non-supernatural first-person narrative of mourning a lover. The excerpt on the slide, however, is taken from a completely different version that is much closer to The Unquiet Grave, in that it is a conversation between the mourner and the dead, though here the genders are reversed. In The Unquiet Grave, the returned lover is explicitly described as a ghost when he first appears. And we can infer that he looks similar to how he did in life, despite being dead for a year. His grieving partner recognizes that he is dead, but is not horrified by him. He is, nonetheless, strongly linked to the physical realities of the grave. He is clay cold and pale, his breath is earthy strong, and his touch poses a serious risk to the living. In Tom Shincha Adahuma, the changes wrought by death are more significant. Again, there is no horror in the appearance of the dead lover. She simply appears different, though this is put down less to post-mortem decay than being outside in the graveyard for some months. So on the one hand, we have a level of distancing from the realities of physical decomposition and some ambiguity over what exactly has returned. But in both cases, the dead are intimately connected with and affected by the ongoing experience of the grave. And we will see a continuation of this in our next song, combined with more overtly religious ideas of life after death. The titular wife of Usher's Well is a wealthy woman with 3 sons, who she sends away to further their chances in life. In some versions, this is explicitly to get an education. But tragedy strikes almost immediately, and all 3 are killed. Again, depending on the version, their mother either just fervently wishes for them to return or explicitly curses the sea to allow no fishing until her boys return in flesh and blood. And return they do, but their appearance is handled rather differently to The Unquiet Grave. The sons are not described as pale, cold or decayed in the typical way of corpses, but they are marked as having come from another world by their hats, which are made of bark from a tree that grew not on earth but in paradise. In some versions, this is specifically a birch tree, which is linked in folklore to death and resurrection. And while the sons appear to be present in flesh and blood as demanded, their behaviour reveals them as having passed beyond mortal life. They are adamant that they cannot eat and drink what has been laid out for dinner, nor can they sleep in the beds that have been prepared for them, because they must return to the grave at dawn or they will be missed. American versions of this song tend to place a greater emphasis on the afterlife and less on death itself, in several instances replacing the statement that cold death is lord of all with the assurance that they will be dining in the morning with their saviour. But at the same time, the connection to the grave that we saw in the previous song is very much present here as well. The sons are preparing to return to paradise and to the grave. And again we have the first-hand experience of conditions below ground. The tears once again wet the winding sheet. And in a wonderfully morbid little detail that might get lost in the old language, the worms are apparently complaining about the absence of the bodies. One thing that makes these narratives interesting is the role of the dead in setting things right. There are many examples in both folk traditions and Gothic literature of the problematic dead, whether in the form of ghosts or revenants who behave in ways that frighten or disturb the living, or actively dangerous undead figures such as vampires and zombies. But here it is the living who are problematic and in need of correction. And that is really important for the way that these stories were likely understood by contemporaries and how we can understand them today. Although having the dead return in this way is clearly extraordinary and in a clear sense supernatural, it is important to note that the underlying mechanisms are very different from what we are going to explore in the next section on transformation. The walking dead in these folk songs are not powered by magic or enchantment and do not have a human cause. Rather, their appearance can be perceived as allowed by God to resolve a troublesome situation. And this is absolutely of a piece with other early modern narratives of haunting. As a 1691 pamphlet about a crime solved through supernatural intelligence put it, strange and amazing it may seem to mankind that the ghosts or spirits of the departed should be affrighting and troublesome for the living. Yet this, no doubt, is by the permission of a divine power, who suffers such things to be, to bring secrets to light. So this is a very different conception of the dead returning than we see in vampires, revenants, etc., where the body has become corrupted and is acting contrary to the will of God. It is also very different from the other forms of transformation found in folk songs and stories that originate for the most part outside Christian ideas of nature and the body. And that is what we will turn to now. While humans transforming into other creatures or objects is a staple of myths and legends, it is surprisingly uncommon in folk songs. This has been attributed to religious suppression of ideas that did not fit within a Christian worldview, which affected songs more than spoken word stories. On a practical level, it is not hard to see why it would be easier to keep quietly telling stories that are considered unacceptable than it is to set them to music and really hammer home the points over 14 verses. Hugh Shields further argues that when traditional songs were revived and altered during the broadside ballad period, this often involved the rationalisation of supernatural elements in accordance with contemporary tastes. Though he finds the supernatural could also be introduced into songs that were originally grounded in the here and now. And this sits well with the broader context of the period between roughly the 17th and early 19th centuries, which saw a decline in, but not a total elimination of, magical beliefs and practices alongside the rise of scientific thought. In this section, we'll be exploring how themes of bodily transformation manifest themselves in traditional songs, how the supernatural can be seen to reflect contemporary experiences and anxieties, and how ancient tales of magic could be rationalised over time. But I'd like to start by laying down some foundations with a song that is very much rooted in Celtic folklore in its approach to magical transformation. The Scottish ballad of Tam Lin has been around in print since at least the mid-16th century, and tamlin.org lists no less than 46 different versions. It is the story of a woman named Janet who enters a forbidden forest where she meets and sleeps with the mysterious and highly attractive Tam Lin. After returning home, she realises she is pregnant and returns to the forest, where Tam Lin explains that he is unable to leave the forest because he is being held captive there by fairy magic. To free him so that they can raise their child together, Janet has to pull him down from his horse when he rides out with the fairies on Halloween, and hold tight to him as he is transformed into a series of terrifying beasts and other dangerous things. Janet succeeds in holding on until he turns back into a man and is freed. It is somewhat ambiguous whether Tam Lin is truly physically transformed or whether this is simply an illusion. But what is clear is that the magical elements of this story are entirely outside and beyond the human. The forest and the power held over Tam Lin is possessed by the fairies of Scottish legend. And the human characters are essentially playing by the fairies' rulebook, right up to the point where they pass the test and are able to leave the forest. So here we have transformation of the human body that is explained and justified by taking place in a location and through the agency of beings that are not subject to the ordinary laws of nature. Interestingly, while human magic is present in numerous folk songs, we already saw an apparently effective magical curse in The Wife of Usher's Well, the physical transformation of the human body appears only rarely, and almost never in circumstances where the human transforming has agency over the change. The only song that I'm aware of that meets the criteria for today's talk and appears to involve two human beings transforming themselves through magic is The Two Magicians, also known as The Lady and the Blacksmith, The Lusty Smith, and other similar titles. In this story, the blacksmith approaches a woman for sex. She turns herself into a series of animals and objects to try to escape him, while he pursues her in the same fashion. This song can be grouped alongside more common forms of challenge song, where a woman attempts to evade marriage by asking a series of riddles. And the modern version shown on the right puts a twist at the end where the lady tricks the blacksmith into taking the form of a chicken, whereupon she transforms into a fox and takes the upper hand. Where transformation features in other songs, it can be presented as the result of a non-human magic, as we saw in Tam Lin, or it can be rationalised out of songs altogether as a mistake or misunderstanding where no actual transformation took place. But there is also a third category, where a non-human being takes human form. And one of the most prominent examples of this is the legend of the Selkie. The Selkie originates from the Northern Isles of Scotland, where real encounters with grey seals would have been a part of everyday life for the original storytellers. And there are several threads to the Selkie stories that are interwoven with broader superstitions about seals. John Masefield's early 20th century story collection, A Mainsail Haul, includes a siren-like seduction of a young woman by a male Selkie, who leads her back to the sea, apparently unaware that humans cannot survive underwater the way that seals can, with tragic results. But the most common Selkie stories in popular culture involve a human man seeing a female Selkie take off her seal's skin and take human form, and then hiding the skin so she cannot return to the sea and must instead remain with him as his wife. These stories usually end with the Selkie regaining her skin and immediately leaving. There are obvious discussions to be had about gender dynamics, coercion and control in the latter group of stories. But the fact that the means of controlling the Selkie is through the theft of her skin is not an incidental feature. Rather, it connects these well-known stories with a whole raft of other Selkie legends that are deeply embedded with the realities of the age of seal hunting. David Thompson's wonderful mid-20th century book, People of the Sea, gives an account of his travels in the Scottish Isles and the west of Ireland, finding locals who are willing to share their Selkie stories. And many of these stories show the blurring of lines between man and seal, creating a strange and often uncomfortable empathy, as well as a deep discomfort over the killing of seals, even among those who made their living that way. And this complex relationship also comes through in traditional songs. The Great Silkie of Sulskerry opens with a woman nursing a baby, and singing that she doesn't know who or where the father is. The father then makes himself known, and explains that he is a man upon the land and a Silkie in the sea. The Selkie is not described in any detail, beyond being grumly and, in his own estimation, not comely. But one could perhaps employ some imaginative license here and picture him as slightly seal-like in his human form. The Selkie then moves to take the child back with him to the sea and leaves behind a prophecy that the woman will one day marry a gunner who will shoot both father and son. In some versions, the song ends there. In others, there is a postscript where the prophecy is revealed to be true. She marries a gunner, and he goes to sea and shoots 2 male seals, one large, one small. And around the neck of the smaller seal is a little gold chain that she gifted to her young son before he was taken to the sea. The Selkie legend differs from the other examples in today's talk in that the body being transformed is explicitly not human. While in the story of Tam Lin the transformation seeks to turn a human into something other, the Selkie's shapeshifting does the opposite, bringing the other closer to the human. The Selkie, then, can be seen as an imaginative expression of an uncomfortable identification with the non-human, and a way of processing complicated feelings of empathy and guilt, as well as wonder and fascination, over creatures who move between two worlds in a way we cannot. Both the Selkie father and son and the fairies in Tam Lin can be seen to reflect Celtic beliefs that persisted in local culture long after the introduction of Christianity. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, traditional ballads could also be a site of rationalisation of old magical ideas. And in our final part of this section, we'll be exploring that through a hugely popular song collected on both sides of the Atlantic, that takes an intriguing approach to the supernatural in more than one way. The transformation of humans into swans, or shape-shifting from swan to human form, appears in myths and legends from ancient times and in just about every part of the world that contains swans. Famous examples within the traditions that we are concerned with include the 14th century Irish story of the children of Lear, who were turned into swans by their jealous stepmother. Scotland also has its version of spiteful swan transformation in the legend of Loch Sunart. In this story, a young chieftain falls in love with a girl who is of lower birth. His mother, disapproving of the match, turns the girl into a swan. The young man then shoots the swan while out hunting, realises too late who he has shot, and takes his own life in despair. There is a folk song originating from Ireland with very similar basic features, dating back in print to at least the beginning of the 19th century. Americans may know it as the shooting of his deer, but in England and Ireland it is usually named after the central figure of the story, who is known as Polly Vaughan, Molly Bawn, Molly Bond, and other similar variants. This name is most likely a corruption of the Irish Mora Vaughan. The word Bawn or Vaughan literally means white, and like the English fair, it has connotations of beauty, innocence, and purity. The central act of Polly Vaughan is the same as in the legend of Loch Sunart. A young woman is tragically shot by her true love while appearing as a swan. But while in Loch Sunart, the woman is physically transformed into a swan. In Polly Vaughan, the identification is a simple mistake. The young man was out hunting swans, saw a white shape in the undergrowth, and did not realise until it was too late that it was Polly, sheltering from a rainstorm, with her white apron pulled over her head. Interestingly, the song then introduces new supernatural elements. When the young man stands trial for the shooting, the ghost of Polly appears in the courtroom and confirms that the whole thing was a tragic mistake. She did look like a swan at the time of the shooting, and there was no intent to harm her. So here we can see not only the rationalisation of magical transformation, but the persistence of the idea of the dead returning to serve the higher purpose of peace and justice that we explored in the previous section. And on that note, I think this is a good time to return to the Cruel Sister and consider how it fits within the themes and ideas we have explored so far. In the last two sections, we have seen the human body go beyond the normal limits of what is possible in two very different ways. In the first, we saw how conceptions of the death of the body and the persistence of the human consciousness beyond death underpin songs about death and mourning. In the second, we saw how the transformation of the body through supernatural agency of either the owner of the body or another individual, in some cases humans possessed of magical ability, in others non-human supernatural beings. We have also seen that these two broad camps are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Songs such as The Wife of Usher's Well draw on both ideas of personal magic and religious ideas of life after death. And all of the songs we have explored today have long coexisted within overlapping regional storytelling traditions and the repertoires of individual musicians. But how do the ideas we have explored today contribute to the story of the Cruel Sister? In this final section, let's examine the story one theme at a time. For this section, I'm again going to be using Lorena McKennett's lyrics to the Bonnie Swans. But I'll bring in common features from the other versions as we go, just to give a broader sense of how the story has been told. On the slide we have, once again, the part of the song where the victim is drowned and recovered from the water when she ends up being caught in the miller's dam. She then has parts of her body salvaged and made into a harp by a passing harpist. You'll notice that we have another example here of the good old mistaking a girl for a swan theme, and this can be found in multiple versions of the song. More importantly, we have the moment where the corpse becomes a harp and begins to play by itself. And it does so immediately without any stated intention or action on the part of the other characters except for having built the harp in the first place. In the previous section, we saw a number of examples where magical transformation of the body occurred through the agency of someone who possessed some form of magical power. But the harpist and the cruel sister does not seem to fit within the same pattern. The people who find the body recognize it as that of a noblewoman, presumably from her clothes and jewellery. But there is no suggestion that anyone recognizes exactly who she is, or even that she is a murder victim, nor that they are motivated to take any action on her behalf. The harp is at this point described across different versions of the song as being able to play alone, and as having a beautiful sound that could melt the heart, and these seem to be the sole reasons why it is subsequently taken to perform at court. The role of its creator, then, is simply to transform the dead into a thing that can produce sound. He has no way of knowing what this will lead to. From the point that the instrument is created, all the agency belongs to the harp. In the final two verses, the harp is brought to the court, where the family of the murdered girl are present, and it is again set down to play by itself. But this time it produces not just a melody, but actual words, addressing the assembled company with the voice and personality of the victim, and outing the sister as her murderer. If we replace harp with ghost, we have something very similar to the end of Polly Vaughan, albeit with the dead acting for the prosecution rather than the defence. And going back even further, we can see this as another example of the dead being restless because there are wrongs that they must help to resolve. The dead are here because the living are not finding the answers on their own and need supernatural help to guide them on the right path. What sets it apart from other supernatural justice songs is that after death, the girl never appears in her original form except as a drowned corpse. Her presence in the living world is through small fragments of her body, her breastbone, fingers, and hair. And although it is not uncommon for folk songs to include the retention of small physical mementos of loved ones such as locks of hair, I am not aware of any other traditional songs where the deceased communicate with the living through anything other than the appearance of a complete body, whether spectral or physical. But there is reason to think that the possibility of body parts retaining the same spiritual connection with the living soul as a complete body would not have been alien to the song's original audience. A similar thinking can be found in relation to the relics of saints. The story of the cruel sister, then, ultimately comes back to the body, the persistence of the individual within the body after death, and to go back to our earlier 1691 source, the permission of a divine power to bring secrets to light. The reshaping of the body into a harp gives the dead a new kind of voice, but its power to speak comes from within, not from any external magic. Over the past 40 minutes or so, we've considered the role of bodily transformation and reconstruction across a number of popular traditional songs. This has been very much an initial investigation of a fairly small sample size, and I believe that there is much more to discover through more comprehensive research into both the songs and their historical context. I hope nonetheless that I have shown that ideas around the body and the transformation, destruction and reconstruction of the body in traditional songs can be traced to both Celtic and Christian cultural and religious practice. Within that, songs of magical transformation can be seen as cultural survivors, persisting into an age that saw itself as more rational, and the stories as belonging to a legendary past, more than to present and future possibilities for human beings. But even as magic began to decline in the popular imagination, the persistence of beliefs around the continuing connection of body and soul after death, and the role of both the living and the dead in allowing the dead to find their eternal rest, can be seen reflected in songs about bereavement and grieving, but also violent death and the pursuit of justice. The Cruel Sister is, still by any reasonable measure, a very, very weird song. And I think we probably all have some unanswered questions about that harpist. But we can now see it as part of a wider collection of songs that give agency to the dead to achieve their own resolution. And I think the power of that idea goes a long way to explaining why, after 4 centuries, we are still listening. Thank you for your time today, and do please get in touch if you have any comments or questions.